Hi students, this is Professor Lorenzo, and in this lesson we're going to talk about comma usage. We're going to talk about the 8 ways to use commas. This is a very important lesson because commas are probably the most incorrectly used punctuation in the English language. So we'll go over this, and I want you to pay attention, close attention to how you're using commas in your upcoming essay. And you can base your knowledge on this video. So the first way to use a comma is to separate independent clauses. Independent clauses, if you remember, are clauses that can stand on their own. And so that tells you that you need to always use a comma before a fanboy, otherwise known as a coordinated conjunction. And I'm sure you all know what your fanboys are. So in the first instance, we have he walked down the street. That's an independent clause because it can stand on its own. We have a comma before the coordinated conjunction and it separates the second independent clause. Then he turned the corner, which again is a sentence that can stand on its own. So always remember to use a comma to separate independent clauses, i.e. before coordinated conjunctions, also known as fanboys. The second way you use a comma is after an introductory clause or phrase. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes people make on their essays. So in example number 1, you have an introductory clause. When Evan was ready to iron, so what you're doing, you're introducing some action or introducing a statement that's going to come up. His cat tripped on a cord. Make sure you always use a comma in between those types of clauses. An introductory clause, in other words, something that is, or words that are introducing a second clause, has to have a comma between them. This second one is near a small stream at the bottom of the canyon. He's about ready to explain something to you. Park rangers discovered a gold mine. So always use a comma in that instance. The third is to use a comma between all items in a series. So you see in number 1 we bought apples, comma, peaches, comma, and bananas today. So that's a series of words. There should be a comma after every word. You have apples, peaches, and then before the and in bananas. Then we have a second one here where we have a series of clauses. Mary promised that she should be a good girl, comma, that she would not bite her brother, comma, and that she would not climb onto the television. So anytime you're going to have 3 series of clauses, series of words, you need to have some comma to separate them, especially if you're going to use the word and or any other coordinated conjunction. And number 3, the instructor looked through his briefcase, comma, through his desk, comma, and around the office for the lost grade book. Now, and I'll caution you, there are times where you may not use a comma in these, but we're not going to go into that. It's a little bit more complicated than we need to at this point in time. Right now, just make sure you always use a comma to separate 3 items in a series, or a group of 3 items or more in a series, and we'll be okay with that. The fourth is to set off non-restrictive clauses. This is a little more complicated. Here, the rule says use commas to enclose clauses not essential to the meaning of a sentence. These non-essential clauses are called non-restrictive. Clauses which are essential are called restrictive. Both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses may begin with a relative pronoun such as who, whom, whose, that, which. A relative pronoun refers to the noun or pronoun that precedes it. Let's take a look at the first sentence. So Stephen Strom, who is what this sentence is talking about, afterwards they say, who show you like. So what you have is someone here is trying to basically tell their friend or maybe someone else about a person who has a television show, but they're trying to remind them that they like them. So they're saying Stephen Strom, comma, who show you like. There's the non-restrictive clause. In other words, it's not really essential to the whole sentence, but it's just reminding the person, you know what, you like them, so listen to me. And then here we have the most important part, is that we'll host a party next week. So we're really what they're talking about is Stephen Strom will host a party next week. But if they need to explain to this other person that there's someone that it's someone that they know or someone that they like, they'll put a non-restrictive clause in there. You know, in other words, who show you like. Or say you were talking about your friend or trying to explain something to your friend or tell your friend about someone else that you think they know. You're not sure if they know, but you want to remind them of them. So you say, Kanisha, You know, the girl with purple hair, that's your non-restrictive clause right there. She's going to be at the party last night. It's a simple type of phrase that a lot of us use. So try to remember that when you're doing your writing. Here we've got John, again, who spent the last 3 days fishing, is back on the job again. Who spent the last days fishing is the non-restrictive clause. Here we have a restrictive clause. The gentleman who was standing by the fireplace is a well-known composer. So use a comma to set off a positives. This is sort of like non-restrictive clauses, but Alexander Pope, the Restoration poet, this is just someone basically telling you a little bit more information about that person. These are a little more difficult, so we're not going to get into them too much, but just remember, if you're starting a sentence off with someone's name or maybe with a proper noun, and you got to explain who that person is to the reader, then you want to have a comma after the beginning name. Number 6, use a comma to indicate direct address. So this would happen if you were writing dialogue. So if you're writing dialogue and when one person is talking to another, you need to always put a comma before the second person's name. So the person talking is I think, and they're talking to John, comma, John, you're wrong. And also after John's name, John, comma, I think you're wrong. So if you're going to do some dialogue where you got two people talking, you need to always have a comma before the person's name or after the person's name who's been talked to. All right? And then you use a comma to set off direct quotations. Remember, all punctuation goes inside the quotation marks, not outside the quotation marks. And we can see that here. We can see that here. But if you're going to introduce a quote, you have to put a comma before. In other words, Mary said, comma, and then the quotation. Here, we have the quotation, I dislike concerts because the music is too loud, comma, and then she said. I will warn you, there are incidences where that is not necessary. However, for our class, for our purposes, always put a comma before the quotation and after the quotation when you're using the tag. Mary said and she said are called tags. So always put a comma after the tag and before the tag. And this last one, we're not going to worry too much about right now. This is using commas with dates, addresses, titles, and numbers. We'll talk about it a little bit further. However, of course, there's a static lesson here, so you can go and take a look at it if you really want to understand how to use them with commas, addresses, titles, and numbers. That's something you can work with on your own. So this is about commas. Hopefully it helps you, and I'll look to see if it helps you in your upcoming writing. Thank you, and I'll see you in class soon.